I've had a fondness for city builders ever since I first played Anno 1602 as a child. I played that game so often, despite not knowing what the hell I was doing. I was the kind of kid who would build 1,000,000 wooden huts to bring up my population number faster than the CPU rivals, because apparently I thought that that was the only metric that counted. Only to then watch my entire population starve or get mad at me whenever I had to raise taxes because I lacked funding for everything else, without ever having a clue why. Yeah, I wasn't the smartest kid. Anyway, over the years I've played a few other city building games, though not to any great depth. I found that often these games tend to run out of steam for me because you either end up in a situation where you've reached a balanced economy and the game basically plays itself, which happened to me when I played City Skylines for example, or the game has some kind of impossible to overcome hurdle during the late game, like a rare resource running out entirely while you've upgraded and maxed out all the buildings and research trees. Both outcomes always kinda rub me the wrong way because there's often just no satisfying conclusion to any of these scenarios, but somehow I still keep coming back to these types of games. Honestly, I had almost kind of given up on ever finding a city building game that offers the kind of crescendo seen in pretty much every other genre that, when it's all over, leaves you satisfied with what you've achieved. But holy shit, I was not expecting Frostpunk to deliver this hard on that front. Now I'll be primarily focusing on the initial campaign. There are multiple scenarios you can unlock later, but I feel like discussing the first one should probably give you enough information to figure out if this game is for you or not, because even if you don't play any of the other scenarios, Frostpunk is still worth playing for the first scenario alone. The basic premise of the game is that the world has for all intents and purposes ended because of a cataclysmic eternal winter that engulfed the entire planet. You're in charge of a group of survivors from 19th century London who managed to find shelter in a crater that houses a generator at its center which produces the warmth that keeps you alive. You have a few piles of resources like coal, wood and steel lying around on the surface of the crater which you can gather up manually, but these can run out if you don't start researching buildings that can provide you with unlimited resources. Now don't think that just because you can have a coal mine that produces an unlimited supply of coal that managing resources eventually goes away. Because the cold is ever increasing, so you constantly need more coal to heat up your population, more wood and steel to research better housing, and obviously more resources to build all those houses, especially once additional refugees start pouring into your city. What I like about these basically infinite resources is that it takes away the tedium of having to find them, so the game can focus on giving you other problems to worry about, like the aforementioned ever-increasing cold. But I think the most brilliant stroke of genius was how the game uses your citizens to force you into some really tough moral quandaries. They have two metrics which determine their overall behavior towards you: hope and discontent. Hope reflects your people's outlook and confidence in your abilities to guide them through these harsh times, while discontent focuses on how well your decisions are liked. You can choose to enact laws that unlock new abilities or buildings and impact hope and discontent in various ways. For example, choosing to legalize child labor allows you to employ them in your various factories, but you can also choose to not legalize child labor, which unlocks a child shelter that looks after children while their parents are off working. Both choices impact the hope and discontent of your population in some manner. Obviously, legalizing child labor makes it easier for you to allocate the additional human resources, and that's exactly why I like it as a moral problem. Because the immoral action should be the one that makes life easier for you, while the moral action should come with certain sacrifices. I think this is the first game I've ever played where the game doesn't use a moral choice system to judge you or give you a good and evil flavor of what in the end basically is the same power, instead opting for exactly what morality in real life is, and that's really refreshing. And these options for moral play without judgment from the game are fairly frequent. You can send out scouts into the frozen wasteland to check out a bunch of sites for survivors or resources, and whenever you do find survivors, you have multiple choices you can make. You can escort them back to your city, which means everybody is going to make it back alive. You can also send them off to the city alone, which will cause some of the refugees to die on the way there. And finally, you can just leave them there to die. The game doesn't judge you for either of those choices, and the people back home are also completely unaffected with regards to their hope and discontent values. You just have to live with the fact that you left all those children in that icy cave to freeze to death because you didn't think you'd have the resources to feed and house them. Especially if you didn't legalize child labor so they wouldn't be of any use to you, since this game is played over several days and not years, so those children won't grow up into productive members of society and instead remain a constant drain on your resources. One thing that did irk me somewhat was that discontent rises whenever you have to schedule extended work hours or an emergency 24-hour shift to produce enough resources. But I wasn't exactly angry at the game for implementing the mechanic, not at all. I was more angry at the fact that we as a society behave exactly like this. You as the leader clearly want nothing but the best for your people in this city, and they just whine and complain about having to work long hours in order to secure their fucking survival against the ever-decreasing temperatures. It kinda draws some parallels here towards our own current real-life climate predicament, where we're not too keen on changing our habits for the sake of the environment, even though we clearly know that shit will eventually hit the fan if we don't. So yeah, it's annoying to deal with ignorant idiot citizens in Frostpunk because it's annoying to deal with ignorant idiots in real life. So A+ for realism. Now I mentioned previously that the reason why I stopped playing city builders at some point is because they either end up in a repetitive loop or because they just run out of stuff to do because of some hard brick wall that you can't overcome. Frostpunk solves this issue by actually providing you with a challenge you have to overcome. The scenario is broadly structured into 3 acts. The first act deals with finding other cities with the use of scouts. It mostly serves as a way to incentivize going out into the wastelands. The second act deals with a critical uprising in your city that wants to leave and you have to convince them to stay. During this act, you actually get a second set of laws you can enact. While the first type of laws that you can choose from in the beginning are mostly about adapting to the current situation and mostly reactionary in nature, the second one reflects how you can sway and control the population by giving them a purpose. You can either go for order or faith. As the names imply, order is about strict control through means of policing and keeping discontent down through force, while faith is about beliefs, which allows you to basically use religious ceremonies and an inquisition to maintain peace. There isn't a lot of functional difference between either approach, but there are a few specific ways in which the paths deviate from each other. But it isn't about making a good versus evil choice here, because order can always turn into fascism and faith can always turn into a crusade. It's what the game does with the laws you can enact that's interesting. For my first successful playthrough here, I chose Faith, and for the longest time I was hesitant to employ Faith Keepers, exactly because I didn't want to go all inquisitorial on my people. But on my previous attempt, when I chose Order, I also wasn't too keen on enforcing the rules by force. Now when I did use Order, I also made a couple of other distinct mistakes, since this was my very first playthrough and you should always expect the very first one to end in catastrophe in these types of games, which it obviously did. But I eventually learned that, as with the previous example of people getting upset at having to work overtime in order to secure their survival, you kinda need to use some form of indoctrination or involuntary motivation to sway the population. Sure, that does paint a rather grim picture of humanity as a whole, where we kind of have to be tricked into doing what's best for us, but it's also not unrealistic given how dogmatic philosophies have been used throughout the ages. Now I want to get to that final act of the game and the thing that made me absolutely fall in love with it, because it actually manages to have a goddamn boss battle. In a city building game. Imagine that. In fact, don't imagine that, just go out and play Frostpunk. I'm almost loath to spoil what happens after you've managed to convince the would-be deserters from the second act to stay with you, because the first time it happened, it was such a massive punch to the gut that I couldn't believe it. So if you don't want to know what happens, stop the video here, go and buy Frostpunk and play it immediately. If city builders interest you even slightly, and if what you've heard from me about the game has made you think that it's worth checking out, don't let me spoil this for you. Okay, ready? Here we go. After the game lulls you back into what you assume is smooth sailing after dealing with the uprising, Mother Nature strikes back hard, because eventually you'll notice that more and more refugees start turning up at your doorstep. And only a few days later, the game announces that a massive winter storm is headed directly for your city. Now the game has already been decreasing the temperatures over time from a comparatively warm and sunny -20 degrees Celsius to a tepid -70 degrees Celsius. But the game really does not fuck around when that winter storm hits, with temperatures going down to -120 degrees at first, only to ramp up to a willy shriveling -150 degrees for a few in-game hours. I was absolutely screwed and simply couldn't manage to gain the upper hand during that temperature drop, because I got complacent during the second act and didn't think the game would actually go where it eventually does, so when shit really hit the fan the first time around, I just embraced the situation in order to see what would eventually happen. Fortunately, I had a manual save ready just after that second act, So I jumped back into it, and with a concerted effort I managed to prepare all the necessary research and buildings, gather up the required resources to feed my population and keep them warm, while also casually declining to let any non-healthy people enter my city as to not overburden my medical facilities. Now I can't convincingly relay here just how tense it was, sitting here seeing the hours go by while my city sat there frozen like an ice cube. Because at that stage you can't do anything anymore, it's too cold for the buildings to operate. If you have a bunch of automatons ready, they can assist you in still producing certain resources during that stretch, but honestly, if you're not 100% ready before that storm hits, it's basically a death sentence. And then, that glorious moment when the storm finally lifts and the temperatures rise back up to minus 30 degrees Celsius. This kind of narrative arc is exactly what I've always wanted from a game like this. I'm not sure if I can even go back to a traditional city builder again, because this is the kind of experience that changes how you view a genre and massively lifts your expectations for future games in it. So yeah, that's my conclusion. Frostpunk is in every sense of the word an elevation of the city builder. No two ways around that, because it doesn't just get the mechanics absolutely right, it also gets the narrative right. And that's what makes the game stick in my memory.